It's time for the Chapter and Chatter Cafe with Camden County Library District Director, Professor Jim Paisley.
All right, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I am doing well.
Hey, you ready for this?
I think so. You know what chapter this is? The number
No.
13.
Really?
Yes, this is
Oh,
our 13th
lucky
chapter.
13.
That's it.
All right.
And it's a beautiful.
Beautiful springtime day.
That's right.
You know,
Get a
April
little bit
showers.
of rain. Yes.
You know.
Mayflowers.
Yes, we're going to get a little rain, it looks like. But,
Especially this weekend. I think
oh,
about
yeah.
3 inches.
Oh, yeah.
All said and done.
Good grief.
That's what my
Good grief.
phone said earlier.
Well, there you go. Well, I won't have to work out in the yard then.
Well, you may still have to. I don't know.
Well, you're right. You're right.
Watch those floodplains. That's another
There you
story.
go. That's another story. Hey, we've got a great topic for you today. It's something that, believe it or not, has come to the forefront over the last, month or so, and that's tariffs.
Yes.
You know,
That's,
and one of the fascinating things about this whole tariff thing is that almost nobody knows anything about them. You know, they have these ideas that, you know, well, this came out of nowhere, and why would we be doing this? And I thought it'd be interesting to give a little history of tariffs in the United States.
I think what is amazing is the numbers that are being tossed around. What was it yesterday? 245%
Yes.
tariff on China. Goods
Right.
coming out of China or going in?
Yes.
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 And then
coming in.
now we can't get any rare earth metals right now from
Right.
China because of it.
Yeah. I had a car when I was 16 that I financed through a local bank, and I think the interest rate was 245, around that. You know, it seemed like
2.45 or 2?
No, it was 245%.
Okay.
I think, and, you know, as you know, Big Lou kind of guy.
Yeah,
you know, and
yeah.
I'm like, okay, you know, but
So
it
you're
seemed
still
like
paying on that car,
yes,
right?
oh, still paying on it. Yeah, you know how it is. You
Yep.
know, we've all had one of those, right?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about tariffs. All right. Now, people have said tariffs is a tax. That's exactly right. That's true. Tariffs are just simply taxes on imported goods, things that come here, all right? And basically, they've been a part of the U.S. history from day one. Been around forever. It's not something new that just popped up.
Are you sure?
Well, you know, you would think it the way people are talking, but it's been around forever, okay? And until the Civil War, they made up most of the money that the federal government operated on,
Gotcha.
nearly all of it, okay? And they have been an important source of revenue for the U.S. for forever, okay?
Sounds like it.
300 years.
So since inception.
Yes, and the only thing that changed was that in 1913, they turned around and passed this nasty thing called the 16th Amendment, which is income tax. You know, we can all relate to that. You
Just
know, we
finished them up.
just this week, right?
Yep, that's another appropriate
So,
topic.
you know, I'm surprised more people haven't said, you know, would a tariff be better than an income tax?
Would it?
Well, you got
I
to
mean,
ask
you're
yourself
looking
that.
at numbers right now. Like I
Yeah,
said,
well-
245%.
Think about it. You know, from 1789 to 1913, you didn't
That's
pay
what we
income
had.
tax.
Right. That's what we relied on was tariffs.
I want to know who the guy was that turned around and said, well, you know, we shouldn't be taxing foreign governments that are in here trying to, you know, get their prices down.
Why can't we do both?
Well, there you go, you know. But instead, they came up with a brilliant idea. Oh, we don't need that. We'll tax you instead,
Yeah.
you know. So thank you very much for that.
Me?
Yes, you know, well, and me too,
All right.
you know.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get into that. Yeah, you know. Now, basically, in simple terms, a tariff is a tax, okay? And a country's government imposes it basically on goods that are imported from other countries. Now, the import business pays the tariffs, okay, when the goods cross the border of the country, okay, usually at a seaport or an airport now. A lot of it comes
Right.
in by air. Now, I found a really good book. It's called Clashing Over Commerce, and it's a history of U.S. trade policy. You know, it's a good snoozer, if nothing else, you know. Guys like me can read it, but a lot of people...
I was going to say, it's got a lot of technical
But, you know,
jargon,
if
doesn't
you've
it?
got this problem with, you know, insomnia and you can't sleep, this is an excellent book for that. You can read about 4 pages and you're out, okay? But here's the deal. This guy, he is really smart. He's from Dartmouth College, and he wrote this book called Clashing Over Commerce, and his name is Professor Irwin. Now, Irwin said there's 3 reasons for tariffs. Basically broke it down real simple, the 3 R's: revenue, restriction, and reciprocity.
I'm glad you pronounced that word.
Yes, big words. Now, so first off is revenue. It's a great way to make money.
Yeah.
Like you said, what we were talking earlier, 245%.
Yeah,
you know,
that's astronomical.
That's a good chunk of change,
Yeah.
right? And so they can raise revenue using these tariffs, all right? Now, they also can use this for restriction. And what that is they can raise the tariffs, which then what happens is it keeps out foreign goods. The foreign competitors, they can't afford to pay the tax to get their products here. And so it's great for our home businesses because you can make it here cheaper.
If we have the infrastructure, right?
If we have the infrastructure. There's the problem we're running into now. You know, the stuff that we're importing is a huge problem, you know, because we don't
have any
right.
businesses. I mean, we do have businesses, don't get me wrong. We
Right.
do have businesses, but we don't have the infrastructure like we used to have.
Right.
Everything moved overseas.
Yep.
We have nothing that says, you know, made in USA hardly anymore.
That's right.
I mean, even vehicles. Detroit was the big capital city for
Yeah.
vehicles. And
What
now,
is an American vehicle now, right?
Right. Is there an actual all-American vehicle anymore?
No,
No.
not that I'm aware of.
Because you get parts from Mexico, Canada,
Yeah,
China.
right. Now, you know, what's interesting is the fact that we've talked earlier about this all the way back when we were talking about trade and the American Revolution and all that. If you'll remember, there was something called the Townshend Acts. Mm-hmm. Now, the Townshend Acts were basically taxes that the British put on all the goods that they sent us. We're sitting out here in the wilderness, basically. We couldn't make anything. And so everything we did, we sent, you know, natural resources to England, and they manufactured it, and then they sent it back and put a huge tax on it.
Right.
Well, the Townshend Acts were on the things that we can't make, just like you said. It was paper, paint, lead, and glass, and, oh, that other little thing, tea.
Oh, yes,
Right?
yes, Boston
Yeah,
and
you're right.
party. And
Yeah, so if we wanted it, and it's something we couldn't make ourselves, they put a huge tax, the British did, on us, the tariffs. And so you can see why from day one of the first things Congress did is they said, we need to address this issue of tariffs, because they'd been getting taxed to death with tariffs under British rule.
Right.
So that's where it kind of started, okay? Now, we already said, you know, revenue and restriction, and then the last one is reciprocity, which is kind of interesting. Basically, if we have tariffs on other countries, all right,
Right.
then basically what we do is we negotiate. They have a tariff on us, we have a tariff on them, and so what we decided is, all right, we'll negotiate a deal. You're going to have a 285% tax on me, well then, I'll put 285% on you, which is exactly what we're seeing happen today.
Right.
All right? And this has been going on since 1789. All right? Now, basically, you know, it's a tit for tat kind of thing.
Right.
All right? So it's a trade war, if you will. All right?
Makes sense.
Now, the use of and the debate over these tariffs goes back, like I say, to the founding of the United States. Now, we saw free trade as being very important because, like I say, the British had been taxing the living daylights out of it. So naturally, when we formed our country, we're like, all right, you know, to heck with this, you know.
Right.
We're not going to pay this anymore. Now, unfortunately, the problem is once we won the revolution, everybody goes, yay! All right, well, now we're going to form this government. And people are going, does it pay anything? Well, we don't have any money. Now, where will we get the money? Well, we don't have, you know, taxes? No, I don't think so. No, you know, we just fought that war, so basically they just created this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which was
Right.
the first, basically, our first constitution, if you want to call it that.
Amendments or
It was a government run by Congress with no president. Can you imagine how wonderful that would be today? I mean, they can't even decide where to go to lunch, right?
I'm not going to say anything.
Yes, exactly. And so, needless to say, that's not going to work very well. But the Articles of Confederation didn't have anything in there about taxes.
Right.
It was really great that they all got together and said, we're going to form this great country and everything, and we're going to do this.
Somebody forgot to write that on the cocktail napkin.
Yes,
didn't
and
they?
somebody at the end of it said, okay, we got any money? No. And so you know what they did? They contacted the colonies and they asked for donations. Yes, now I would love to see that today, you know.
That would be interesting.
You see that, you know, Washington call us and say, please, Missouri, would you donate some money for us for our study of the
Wait a
rare
minute here. You know,
Tasmanian darter or whatever?
Right, well, like the ASA, the one with the dogs.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
they do the Sarah Evans song. And
Yes.
Sarah,
You know.
or not Sarah Evans, but
Yes,
Sarah
we could have
McLaughlin.
a video of the poor,
And
poor, pitiful
guys.
little starving politicians with their tin cup out on the street corner saying, please, Missouri,
I
just
might
a
have a
little more."
penny.
Yes, alms for the poor, right? So bottom line is, you know, they're sitting there looking at this and saying, well, we're going to have to come up with a way to get the money. And so it was voluntary back then. The 13 colonies, the states.
So it was, you could just send whatever you wanted.
Yes, and that's a good point. They'd say, well, seeing as how New York, you're a big state and you got all this trade and everything, we think you ought to give $1 million a year. And New York would come back and say, here's $50,000, spend it wisely. And that's the way it worked, okay? So,
Had to stay in budget.
yes, so that kind of pushed them to have to look for other ways to get money. And so, sure enough, what happened on July the 4th of 1789, President George Washington, having, you know, they just sat down and said, this articles thing ain't working, we need to draft our own constitution, a new constitution, and that was what came out about it, is where we're going to get the money, and they said, we will sign the Tariff Act. That was one of the first things that George Washington signed, was a tariff, okay? So when everybody's on the news raising hell about tariffs, bear in mind, it was George Washington that started this.
Thank you.
Okay? Yes. And so he turns around, and it's legislation that was passed by Congress. Congress passed it. Now, the government needed this power to tax, because without the power to tax, then, you know, they had these duties they were supposed to do. We talked about those.
Yes.
Not very many of them.
Not
but, you
very
know,
many. Like,
you
what,
gotta-
13?
Yeah, you got to run a
18.
post office and this sort of thing, you know,
Right.
and the national defense and, you know, all this stuff. And they said, well, we got to have some money. And so sure enough, they decided, all right, we'll do tariffs. And of course, one of the big ones we were going to put a huge tariff on was England, you know, turnabout's fair play, right? Now, basically, the biggest headache they had was the inability to enforce the tariff. How are you going to do that, all right? Now, American Revolution was followed by an economic reorganization. During the war, everybody kind of, you know, put agriculture kind of on the back burner. They'd go back home to, you know, get the crops in and, you know, in harvest time. But everybody was busy in manufacturing.
Right.
Because we weren't be able to get anything from England anymore. So now this is where we start weaving our own cloth and making our own hats. You know, we
Yes.
talked about the beaver hats and all that, and manufacturing what we needed in the way of wagons and supplies and everything to keep the army in the field. All right. Well, when the war ended, so did that. So we were sitting there kind of looking at it like, okay, now what do we do?
Right.
And the North had industrialized. That's where they were making, you know, the weapons and the wagons and everything else. So they had pretty well given up their agricultural side of it. And now they're saying, okay, Europe is going to start pumping all of these different products in again, which is going to drop the price way down because people can buy a European product a lot cheaper than they can buy something that's made here in Pennsylvania or New York.
That still sounds familiar.
It does, doesn't it? And so they said, well, you know, we've got a predicament, all right? And so naturally, they're going to raise the tariffs. And this is the thing where it's protectionism, all right? Restriction. What they're doing is they artificially raise the price of the tariffs for the foreign goods coming in so that our businesses here could turn around and make a profit. Okay? Now, the problem with that is that you as John Q. Public, either way, you know, now if you eliminate the foreign competition, you got to trust the American businesses not to jack their prices up, you know, that because they're in it for profit.
Right.
And so there's this balance you're going to have to find, okay? And so that's basically what was driving it. But a lot of it was driven simply by what we had experienced during the American Revolution. All right? That make sense?
Makes sense.
All right. So now what happened is in this tariff of 1789, it protected the local industries from foreign trade. But it, you know, in helping the local businesses compete with the foreign products, like I say, now all of a sudden the local businesses realize, well, we can up our prices, all right? So a lot of people said, well, I didn't gain anything. It's the same price as if I was buying it from England before, okay? And that's kind of the problem we're going to run into here.
Right.
You know, my concern is the next steps with tariffs. Okay, let's say we negotiate and we get these tariffs dropped way down.
Right.
All right. Well, how are we going to turn around and, let's say, auto manufacturing, they're talking about that.
You're right, because of the crossing and the...
Right. So now, all of a sudden, if all the business comes back here, who's going to put the check and balance on the businesses to keep them from jacking their prices sky high?
Right.
Because now they don't have foreign competition.
Exactly. It's almost the sky's the limit.
Right.
But then again, the supply and demand, won't that? I mean, how bad is somebody going to need it? Are they going to continue to drive the same car that they've been driving for the last 10 years and limp it along?
Right.
Before they buy something else? Or,
But limping it along, you're going to need the parts, and where do the parts come from?
well, I mean, can't get them
Right,
anymore.
right. Well, and so the next step, I think, in this is once we start to see the manufacturing come here, the reason why people left to begin with, you know, these businesses, was the high price of wages and supplies and everything here.
Well, I think that was another thing why everything moved overseas. It was
Right.
cheaper labor and...
So our unions are going to be willing to come back and go to work at their own factories here for $40 an hour versus $55. See, there's the problem.
There's a lot of things.
There's a lot of things that are going to have to play out in the long run to make this thing work, okay? Now, basically, also during the war, they had this thing called the Navigation Acts, which the British imposed on us. Basically, what happened is when we were trading with England and getting all of our things that we couldn't make ourselves, England said everything shipped to the United States had to come on a British ship. And so they even tagged us for high prices for shipping the goods back and forth. And what was interesting is that what we saw happen is that when we went to enforce the tariffs, some of the colonies, you know, we're all East Coast, some of the colonies would say, well, if you bring all your goods here to, say, New Orleans or Charleston, we won't charge you that big tariff. But if you go to New York, you know, the industrial bunch, they're going to enforce it. So the southern colonies have a tendency to kind of look the other way because the southern colonies don't want to pay these high prices because they can't make it.
Right.
They can't make this stuff. But in New York and Pennsylvania, they could. And so they're enforcing the tariffs, but the others weren't. So that was another reason why they passed the Tariff Act. They thought, well, we can get the federal government to
wouldn't it
enforce
go back to that tit for tat?
Yes.
Because if they're importing the goods at a lower price, they can export what they have
Right.
at that lower.
Exactly. And so now, you know, you've got this problem of, you know, are we all a unified country? You know, are we going to let each state negotiate their own tariffs? So that was a problem.
And could that be a possibility even today?
Yes, because just this morning, and this is very timely, none other than Gavin Newsom in California is going to sue the federal government over tariffs. He said, this is going to have a tremendous impact on us. No kidding, dude. But, you know, in other words, he's making a ton of money on where they're at right now, okay? But he said, you know, if you start messing around with these tariffs, everything's coming to the West Coast to those ports.
And it's still got to travel all
right.
You've got to add that other extra cost
Right.
of getting it from New York to...
Exactly the same as what we saw between the North and the South. The North could turn around and manufacture their own goods back then. The South was dependent on all the manufactured goods coming there because all they had was cotton.
Right.
Cotton's king. And they had a pretty good deal because England was the #1 textile manufacturer in the world. And so basically England would buy all the cotton they could from us. And
Right.
so bottom line is when they get in this battle over tariffs and the North is raising the tariffs, what happened is they're raising those tariffs on all these goods, and the South is saying, wait, we've got a good relationship with England.
Right.
You know,
Why mess up a good thing?
Yeah, exactly. And so you can see that was the first kind of rumblings of North and South with the Civil War.
And when we were talking about this before, that's kind of where my mind went as well. Is this was, I know slavery was a big issue, but this here would be a bigger part of it as well, because
huge issue.
You've got the wealthy people here in the North, and then you do have the wealthy Southerners, but the reason they got wealthy is because of all their cotton and plantations and things like that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and where it got to be a real problem is the South didn't have any boats. They didn't have any ships. What they did is they contracted with northern shippers, because the North is manufacturing goods.
Right, they got all the ports. And
so they turned around and contracted with northern shippers. The shippers would come down to the South and load cotton at Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, and then they would ship it over. Well, the problem with that is when the South said, no, we don't want to do this tariff thing, well, guess what? Your cotton's on our boat, and we're going to impose it.
Yeah.
Same thing. So, the whole key here, folks, is I want you to think about all the discussions and the things that are happening today. We did all this in 1789.
So, again, everybody does say, history repeats itself.
Right.
So here we are 300 years later, and
Absolutely.
we have a repeat of...
Exactly the same. It was north-south then. Now it's obviously going to be east and west
west.
coast. Yeah, so that's going to be an interesting deal, too. Now, what happened is this whole situation, like I say, produced the first strains between the North and South, all right? Now, as we look at this thing coming down, we see that in the South, the agricultural interests, viewed the high tariff and tonnage rates as a penalty on the South. They're saying, this isn't helping us at all.
Right.
It's helping you guys to keep these foreign goods out, but it's killing us, So the one that was taking the hit was the Southern plantation owners that were selling all the cotton.
Right.
Make sense?
Makes
Okay.
sense.
Now, then comes the War of 1812. And tariff legislation was used to further encourage the nation's domestic industrial growth. In 1828, Congress passed a bill that raised tariffs to as much as 50%.
They would just laugh at that now.
Yeah, and I mean, right now, what they were talking 10% across the board, I think is
so.
what they're saying.
I think so.
Well, all the way back in 1828, Congress passed a bill that was 50% on everybody.
That's crazy.
Okay? Now, it was the steepest increase in our country's history. Now, reaction to the hikes in the tariffs grew the tensions between the North and South. Again, they're saying, good grief, it was bad enough and we were complaining. Now you're going to turn around and really put it to us. So what you see throughout history is this fight between people who are an exporter and people and want lower tariffs, and the importers who want high tariffs.
Right.
Make sense? Yeah,
Yes.
and think about it. Today, think how much time you could spend just analyzing all the different products and services that we provide, that we export from our country. In particular, things like foodstuffs. We're like the bread basket.
Well, yes, because all the grain and all that does get exported out, but then you think about the fruits and vegetables that come in.
Right. But then you sit there and think, okay, if we jack the tariffs sky high in this tariff war, then all of a sudden what's going to happen is people in Europe are saying, we'll go to India or we'll go somewhere else and buy our Russia, and we'll buy our grain and stuff from them.
Right.
And now all of a sudden we're going to find ourselves, our farmers here are going to be in a world of hurt because they don't have any market for their product. Is any of this making sense?
It makes sense.
Yeah. So
Scary thought,
yeah, it is. It's just, there are going to be winners and losers.
There are going to be winners and losers.
And it depends
But
on
who's going to come out?
and how bad do you lose,
Right.
right? Yeah, can I keep my farm while you guys are doing all this stuff? So it's kind of interesting to watch it happen. Now, before the Civil War, and I want you to think about this, tariffs created 90% of the income for our government. 90% of all the money that the federal government took in was from tariffs alone. That's it. All right?
Wow.
Yeah. So, like I said, until you and I started contributing to this whole fiasco,
Thank
it
you,
all
16th
came.
Amendment.
We had the foreign countries were paying for running our government. But now, in our infinite wisdom, say, well, we don't want to do that to them, so we'll tax the
our
living
own.
daylights out of ourselves. I sit there and think,
I was just going to ask that as well.
the other 10% came from like fees for like land leases, things like just simple
License, yeah, I was going to say
yeah,
licensing.
licenses, that kind of thing. So it was basic your bureaucracy, but it was only 10%. So again, we sat there and changed this, and then what really kills me about it is say, okay, we'll do away with the tariffs basically, and we'll put all the tax on our people, and then we took our money and we gave it to the federal government, and then the federal government came back and said, well, you need to do this, this, and this. And we go, well, we're not going to do that. Bear in mind, all the way to the Civil War, we could say, no, it's voluntary.
Right.
Now they come back and say, well, then we won't give you your money back. Wait,
They made it mandatory.
it was my money. No, it's our money now. You gave it to me, and so I will decide whether or not if what you're going to do in your schools and with your roads and everything else. Brilliant, right? How did we do this, right? And so when you look at it, you're sitting there thinking, we had control over the foreign governments through the tariffs, and now instead what we did is we transferred the control from the federal government over us, to us,
Right.
to where they're taxing
Taxing
us.
us.
I don't know. I still scratch my head on that one. So in 1913, we passed the 16th Amendment, and yay, we've taken care of our finance problems. We, the collective we.
The collective.
Yes,
we-
so all in all, wonderful, right? Now, sure enough, in the wake of the stock market crash in 1929, the great crash, right?
Yes.
Congress passed something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Now, this is one you'll hear about a lot on the news, all right? And it was named for its two sponsors, Senator Reed Smoot from Utah and Representative William Hawley from Oregon. I think we got a picture of handsome devils, right? He's got the Brill cream thing going and all, and I mean he's ready to go, right? And so they passed this. Congress passes this Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and basically it raised the country's already high tariffs to a rate of almost another 20%. So now we're up around 70%.
I was going to say, we're talking 70% tariffs.
on foreign goods. Okay, and again, we're doing this because we thought in doing so, we'd pass this tariff, and then money would be coming in, and we could pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. Okay, which at first you sit there and think, okay, well, we need money because we had all those programs, WPA and CCC and all the other things that they were doing.
But we just come out. I mean, honestly, we just come out of a great war.
Yes.
I mean, it'd been 10 years,
Yes.
or 12 years, or something like that.
Exactly.
So we have industry from that.
Bingo. We had built everything in the North, industrialized, to get us through World War I, all right? And so now, here we are, the crash comes, and these factories are all going, what do we do? And they said, well, we'll pass this tariff, and that'll bring money in, and it will keep the foreign goods out, because the foreign goods were a lot cheaper than we could manufacture here. Everybody here is broke.
Right.
But lo and behold, we turned around and passed this thing. Now, of all things, it was Herbert Hoover that passed it, a Republican, all right? And he thought this will fix things, all right? Now, people thought that it would help the economy, because if you keep out imports, then you have to buy domestic goods. But what they forgot is that if we keep out imports, we then start putting a hindrance on the ability of other countries to buy our goods. And sure enough, what the other countries did is what we're trying to do now. They put a huge tariff on us.
Right.
So now we're in a world of hurt. We don't have any food. We don't have anything. Everybody's out of work. And we can't even get cheap foreign goods because we've jacked the tariff up on it.
Yeah.
And, those other countries weren't stupid. They're saying, well, let's see how long they like living in a cardboard box, right?
Right.
So, again, tariffs are used in an economic war. They create tremendous pressure on a country.
Right.
And that's exactly what happens, okay? So what we see is that various foreign countries soon enacted retaliatory tariffs, just like China's doing right now.
Right.
They're like, oh, we'll jack ours up too. And that's where we're at, this inflation thing going back and forth.
Because what was it? Well, last week it was like, what, at 150 or 125? 125.
Right.
And then yesterday I was looking at something and it was 245.
That's right.
Like I said, and then I said, they're trying to keep out the rare
So
earth metals.
who blinks first?
Huh.
Yeah,
that's a game of
China
chicken
comes
I don't
back
want to play.
and says, well, we'll do 1,000%. And
Yeah.
But the thing is again, we've put ourselves in a kind of a terrible situation. Like I said, last Christmas, you go to your Christmas tree and open every package and find me one that didn't come from China.
Well, and that was the thing. What was it in the mid 80s to 90s? It was Made in USA was the big thing that they wanted everybody to have the manufacturers and industry here, and then trying to keep things more local.
Right.
And then,
Boom.
again, it was cheaper to
Yes.
either send it overseas to have it done, or to import it.
Right.
So.
But now think about this. And this is the kind of critical thinking you all need to be using when you're watching the news. China has 1 billion people out there working.
Right. Well, and that was the other thing I was going to
So
say.
now what happens, when they're making widgets for our Christmas trees, and all of a sudden they're saying, the U.S. is saying, well, we're just going to jack the tariff on this stuff to the point where we can make our own widgets here.
But can we make our own widgets here?
Well, there's the problem,
And
right?
then, okay, so say we could theoretically make these widgets. Where are we going to get the money to start these factories?
From the tariffs.
But then again, wouldn't that fall back to like our last discussion last month? Wouldn't that fall under something that was under Congress or? And then so where does that fall into the realm of things with the current administration and them cutting things back?
Bingo.
So,
And you're asking all these, and these are the questions we need to be asking when we're watching the news.
see, that's what I don't understand why people aren't asking more of those questions. Or are they asking the questions and they're not just being put out there where everybody can hear them?
Well, and that's the thing. Everybody's looking at it like, what's the tariff rate today? I don't care what the tariff rate today is. What happens?
If this actually goes through, and then what do we do?
Who's going to make the widgets?
Right.
And how much are the laborers going to charge through their unions to make the widget? Will they keep it below still what China does?
can. Well,
and bear in mind, if China blinks, if they blink, because President Xi over there is sitting there with 1 billion Chinese who are now sitting there going, you got anything to eat?
Right.
And they're not working. Well, those people are not going to sit idly by after their standard of living has gone sky high from selling us all their stuff. Well, now if you cut off all their factories, you've got all those people that are going to turn around and be going to their government and saying, what in the world are you doing?
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So Xi has the same problem that Trump has. He's got people are all over him saying, you are going to kill us economically. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, again, many a government has been toppled through these trade wars.
Right.
And bottom line is, when it comes to a point where you and I can't feed our families.
That's a scary thought.
Yes. Or, all of a sudden we're paying, $80 for a T-shirt that last year was $10. Now we got a problem.
If we get a problem.
Yes.
Or, gas goes to $12 a gallon.
Right. Well, and here's another piece to this. The countries that are coming to the table right now, they're dancing in the streets because it wasn't so much that they couldn't compete with the U.S., they couldn't compete with China. So now all of a sudden, if China jacks their prices up 285%, now all of a sudden all these other countries in Europe, India, Asia, a lot of these countries, Vietnam was one of the ones that came to the forefront.
Yep.
Well, they're coming in on the low end of this and they're saying, well, we'll come in here and we'll make it what would equate to 100% tariff.
And see, that's the thing is, the company that my husband works for, they do work with signs and lighting them with LEDs. Well, they just got LEDs from Vietnam, and my husband's like, well, what does that mean for our company? Are they going to start putting tariffs on stuff
Right.
as well?
Right.
How's that going to affect?
Right. But
things
bear
like
in
that?
mind, we've got this huge market for people to sell products to, and that is a heck of a leverage, okay? So a lot of these countries are going to say, you know what? We couldn't compete before. We had a high tariff, but we'll drop our tariff down enough that they'll go ahead and we'll start trading with the U.S.
But then again, on that other hand, if they start doing that, are they going to be afraid that we're going to retaliate at some point in time like we are with China and say, okay, you know what, we've let you have this tariff at this, now we think that we need to raise that.
There you go. It's a negotiation.
Well,
and how long will it last? How long can we do a 10-year deal? Can we do a 20-year deal? Whatever. You know, and so that's going to be another big question to ask.
I guess technically, we could go like before. You know, we went 200 years, almost 200 years under tariffs.
Yeah.
But could our infrastructure just worldwide handle something that long term?
Well, let me ask you this question. If in the perfect world everything played out with the tariffs, and we went back to just tariffs and they said you don't have to pay any more income tax, where would you stand on tariffs?
Well,
I know. See,
But then again, as you pay in tax dollars, don't we have some say in how that gets spent?
I don't think so. But then again,
okay, that's the hope that you could. But I mean,
national defense, yeah, things like
right,
that. But,
right.
Yeah, but it is. It's an interesting. You're talking about a shift, a huge shift of taking the burden off the individual taxpayer and putting it on a foreign country that's trying to make a profit off of us.
But is that still what could happen?
It could.
But is that
or
something
it could go the way of the Great Crash, and all of Europe says, well, let's just wait a minute. Let's just turn around and see how long they can go without their, fancy widgets and everything that they have to have.
That's the other thing is, what's to stop them from not raising taxes? Get the tariffs and then raise taxes.
Well, that would be the big question, because bear in mind, in 1913, your taxes was an 8.5 by 11 sheet that charged 7% tax on everybody making over $1 million. Nobody made $1 million. People didn't make $400 a year back then.
Can we go back to that?
Yeah, I think that would be great, So again, and it's interesting when you go back and look at things like the Federalist Papers, the anti-federalists were saying, if you allow the federal government to tax, what's going to stop them from just jacking the price up to every year to whatever, we'll be taxed to death.
Right.
They're saying this in 1789. And now we're sitting there looking at each other like, why didn't anybody say anything? Well, there it was.
It was.
Yeah.
It was said, just nobody listened.
That's exactly right,
The wax was not cleaned out.
Exactly. So bottom line to this is that what we see is that from 29 to 32, we had all of these different foreign countries were, doing retaliatory tariffs on us. And it blew up in our face. It didn't work the way we planned on it, okay? Now, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act would be the last legislation in which Congress set the tariff rates. The last time, okay? Congress sat down there. It was their baby, okay? And basically, they said, this is not good for my political career. When people are living in cardboard boxes and there's no food and there's no imports coming in. And so what happened is Congress turned around and said, I think this should be handled by the president. Now, think about this, guys. I just watched
just came back and bit us.
I just watched the news last night, and they're saying, it's unconstitutional that the president is doing tariffs.
But they handed that over to him.
Yes, they did. Now, they never changed the Constitution. It still says that Congress has the authority.
Okay, then in that respect, can Congress say, nope,
yes,
we're not going to do this?
Yes, they could.
But then can't that be vetoed?
It could be. But again...
Or am I not thinking
No, you're
logically?
thinking perfectly, but you would put yourself in Congress in the same position that Congress back then was in that they made the brilliant idea, let's put a tariff on things during the Great Depression, and it all went into the toilet. And they're like, President did it. It was his idea. I didn't do it. Not, you know.
So they got to have somebody that the bus can hit.
Exactly. So you got to ask yourself the question: would Congress right now want to take that on?
Probably not.
Yeah. You know, I mean,
it's so divided.
If we buckle, what's to keep China from saying, well, we'll just raise ours to 1,000%? Obviously, they don't have the guts to turn around and stick it out.
Wants to stop them either way.
I know. It is. It's a huge conundrum. Yeah.
Did they pass a law to make the president to give that authority to the president?
The question was, did they pass a law to give that authority to the president? The answer was no, they didn't. They just turned around and what happened is Hoover, obviously,
they just handed it to him on a silver platter.
Yes, when the great crash came, and Hoover's in there saying, "Well, nobody's really starving." Brilliant move. You know, let him eat
He obviously
cake.
wasn't outside, was he?
No. And then what happened by a landslide? What happened is we had FDR come in.
Right.
And he came in with complete control of the House and Senate. The Democrats took control. And again, the politicians in Congress said, well, FDR wants to do all these things. Go ahead, you handle it. And so they handed it to FDR and said, you set the tariff rates. Now, it wasn't anything, you know, they didn't pass any kind of legislation, but they said, everybody loves FDR with his fireside chats and the whole bit. And so they gave it to him. And now they're sitting there saying, we need to take it away. Well, you gave it to your president so that he had the power to do it. And it has been that way from the time of FDR all the way forward. It has been the power of the president to set the tariff rates.
So it's in writing somewhere?
Not formally.
Not formally.
It's,
I like
you know,
that answer.
there's hearings and stuff, but it basically, yeah, they're saying, yeah, well, he's more in tune with, you know, the foreign affairs and all of that, and it's really something that you can weaponize and use. So he's commander of the military. So this is something that he can use as another tool in his arsenal to put pressure on other countries. That was their justification.
Can we have another discussion on that?
Yes, I think we should. Yeah. So bottom line is that we see that all of this has been handed over to the president, and FDR, naturally, he's sitting there saying, all right, I'm going to step in here and fix this. Now, Roosevelt signed into law what he called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. Now, this is something that was passed by Congress, but FDR signed it, okay? And it was a new era of U.S. trade policy based on the principle of negotiating lower tariffs with other countries to promote economic growth here, okay? It's just kind of like what Trump's trying to do now, all right? Now, after World War II, we wanted to get the world economy back on its feet, all right? And one way to do that was to stimulate world trade.
Right.
Now, basically, we said we're willing to cut our tariffs if other countries are willing to sign up and reduce theirs. This is after World War II. Now, bear in mind, after, you know, we had geared up big time during the war, industrial-wise.
Right, right. I mean,
we can't very well.
We converted our factories and things to be able to produce weapons and things like that.
Singer sewing machine is making rifles. So,
right.
But bottom line is, when the war ends, everybody's going,
now what do we do?
Yes. And so now we're wide open here to try and figure out, okay, what do we do to keep foreign countries from coming in at cheaper products? And so we started negotiating tariffs back and forth. This is after World War II, okay? Now, this drove our economic policies forward, from that point forward, basically, for decades. And we came to something, another agreement with foreign countries called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT Agreement. Some of you have heard of that, GATT. And then the mother of all these agreements, the World Trade Organization. That's where this comes in. Yeah, these guys, right? Now, from there, we also created the North American Free Trade Agreement, okay? And basically, everything was negotiated through every one of these, GATT, World Trade Organization, the Free Trade Organization. All of those things were negotiated by the president, not by Congress. Think about that.
But they turned that over to him on a silver platter.
Yes. Nothing formal, But he's the one that goes to, you know, like when you see a meeting at the G20 and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You don't see Schumer and
No,
the rest
you
of
see-
them there.
you see
No,
the
it's the president that
president.
negotiates it. And so that's why when you hear him talking about, well, we ought to give this, you know, get this back in Congress's hands. Well, first off, God help us while they're debating on what it should be, you know. And then the second part to that is that, you know, how are you going to handle this if you've got, you know, the split between Republicans and Democrats and the split between California and the East Coast?
Everybody needs a big get-along shirt.
Yeah, exactly. You know, they'll never come to an agreement.
Nope.
All right? So we've empowered the president, even though tariffs are in the Constitution under Article 1, to be handled by Congress, okay? Congress, like I say, has delegated that to the president, okay? Now, in the late 19th century, late 1800s, the Democratic Party, represented then by Grover Cleveland and his running mate Adlai Stevenson, was the party of free trade. Again, these guys, the Democratic Party, Democrats were in the South. So they don't want to see high tariffs because they're primarily importing manufactured goods and exporting their agricultural products.
Right.
All right? The North, on the other side, that's your Republican Party. Those were big business, all the companies and industrial base there in Pennsylvania, New York, so on and so forth. So the divide is there.
Right.
And this is at the end of the 1800s, okay? Now, what we see happen is we wind up with a situation that one of the earliest and deepest blows to the fantasy of a tax-free American utopia, like I say, was the War of 1812. Now, we're expanding rapidly, and we realized, okay, we're going to have to, when this war comes to an end, we're going to have to figure out how we want to do this trade with these other countries, all right?
Seems like every time there's a big skirmish, there is this discussion.
Yes, exactly. Which then leads us up to the situation which put the United States against the British Empire again. And in the War of 1812, like I say, again, it's tariffs. We were dependent on them for stuff, they're dependent on us.
Right.
And so they were negotiating and actually using the tariffs more than they were weapons. You know, it had a lot more clout with a tariff than you do with trying to, you know, sink a ship out at sea somewhere, all right? Now, one drastic measure implemented in response to the British aggressions was the Embargo Act of 1807. This is just prior to the War of 1812. And it put huge tariffs on manufactured goods across the board. Now, in 1844, the great compromiser, they called him, Henry Clay, he gets in there and he says, we need severe tariffs to protect U.S. businesses, all right? Well, needless to say, the southern states, in particular South Carolina, is saying, no, you're jacking it up. And South Carolina literally got to the point where they were going to turn around and just secede from the Union then. Now, I'm talking, you know, we're talking 1807. We're a full 60 years before the Civil War, and these guys are saying, no, we're done with this. And fortunately, what happened is you had a few level heads come in and say, all right, let's just calm down here for a minute. And they reduced the tariff down to about 10% and said, we'll reduce it more every year for the next 10 years to where it goes back down to zero. And South Carolina said, we can live with that. Now, of course, the North lied. You know, that only lasted.
What?
Oh, yeah.
You gotta be kidding me.
That only lasted a little while, and then they said,
A
you know,
year?
I thought you were supposed to reduce this, you know. No.
Yeah,
no,
that didn't
you
even
know.
last a year, then, did it?
There's extenuating circumstances here, you know. Now, in 1828, John Quincy Adams, who was Andrew Jackson's predecessor, he signed off a whole battery of massive tariffs, and the tariffs went back up to 38%. So, again, they lied. I know that's hard to believe, but, you know.
I don't believe you.
Yes. You know, speak with the forked tongue, right?
Right?
Now, Adams attempted to calm the situation with a slightly more modest tariff, which Jackson signed into law in 1832. Again, who signed it into law?
The president.
See? So all the way back in the early 1800s, we're already seeing this is all the president's hands. And again, I think the biggest reason why is Congress doesn't want, those guys do not want to commit to something that could turn a whole economy
Well,
to garbage.
I would be afraid of that as well.
Right,
I guess it'd be better to be bad at one person rather than.
Yes, yeah, at all of them.
Right.
Right, we can get rid of this guy, the rest of the Congress has been in there for 50 years, but, I'm not going to do that. That's what we call a CLM, a career limiting move.
Right?
Yeah, so bottom line is that, here again, let the president decide, okay? Now, what we see happen is that, again, this basically pushes us to a point where they came close to armed conflict, and then they all kind of calmed down and realized this is not good, okay? Now, we saw Henry Clay run for president, okay? And he had already fell to the hands of James Polk in the election of 1844, just prior to the Civil War, simply because of the fact that the Southern electorate was largely tired of all this protectionism. They're saying, you guys are taxing us to death with your tariffs. And so they're fed up with it, okay? And the promises that they'd given them where they were going to lower the tariffs didn't happen.
Took it
so
back.
they're saying, you're lying, all right? So in 1846, they signed, Polk signed the lower-rated Walker Tariff is what it was called. And again, this is the one who was supposed to be reducing it over years, and they just didn't do it, all right? Now, what happened next is when we get into these conflicts, the Republican Party was big time in favor of tariffs. They're saying, yes, this is a way to keep our industries up and running, all right? But now comes another swing of the pendulum, all right? We've got all these tariffs going, and they're in place during the Roaring '20s, Great Gatsby years and all, up to the dawn of the Great Depression. And the Smoot-Hawley Act had enacted all these huge tariffs. Well, the rich guys are happy with them. They're doing fine because it's keeping
they're not
them,
getting taxed.
Yes, and they're keeping the foreign competition out.
Right.
So they're able to jack the prices up, and that's how those guys were living in the Roaring '20s, living the good life, right? All right? Now, all of a sudden, we kept those tariffs all the way until World War II. Now, what happened is when World War II broke out, all of a sudden our factories that were idle and are just getting by, all of a sudden they're booming. Like you said, we're making, changing our car production plants into making bombers and everything. And so then nobody cared about the tariffs. We just kind of let them go by the wayside.
Well, at that point, I think we had bigger things to worry about.
Yes, and so the manufacturers are making a fortune. Now, here's a key point, and I want you to think about this, especially with our arguments today between China and the U.S., Russia and the U.S., basically communism versus capitalism. What happened was, we found that as we're going into World War II, we need allies, okay? Now, Russia needed allies. Hitler needed allies. And so you can sit there and you can talk all you want. Russia, we can create capitalism for you. And, Stalin's going, Niet, right?
Yeah.
And Hitler's saying, I don't need you guys. I've got my own manufacturing base. And so what we did is we needed military allies. And so what we did is we went to the countries that we needed as allies, and we knocked off their tariffs. Smart. And this is what we're doing now. Think about it. We can go to different countries right now and say, currently, we've got a 75% tariff on your goods coming into the U.S. If you'll side with us in any future conflicts with Iran or Russia or China, we'll drop your tariff down to nothing. So you see the power of that, the weapon that it is? And that's exactly what happened. We cut a deal to our allies in World War II so that they could economically boom as well, all right? And needless to say, our enemies, we jacked their tariffs up. Worked perfect, all right? Now, it's this sort of cooperative atmosphere that gave rise to the General Agreement on Tariffs, the GATT treaty that I was talking about, and eventually to the World Trade Organization. In other words, just like we have NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the East countries of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, all the Western countries, they basically did the same thing with the GATT and the WTO. They said, hey, we're all together anyhow. Let's form the World Trade Organization, and then we'll talk economics too. And that's how that all went down. Now, Republicans, who were once the party of unwavering protectionism, jack the tariffs up, they came to establish themselves as the free trade party during the Cold War. Democrats in the post-war era, after World War II, became more and more associated with tariffs and protectionism. Why? Unions. So they basically, the Democrats campaigned on the promise, what we'll do is we'll take all of these unions, we promise you that we will put huge tariffs on China and the rest of these countries, Japan back then in particular, and then you can make cars here. Make sense? So again, a lot of these decisions on this, you got to look behind it. What's behind this? And so they switched. So Republicans became the party that wants free trade.
Right.
And Democrats become the party that wants to restrict things coming in and high tariffs, all right? Which is kind of interesting now in that Trump, who's supposed to be a Republican, he's pushing for the high tariffs.
Right.
But he also gained the favor of the labor unions in this last election.
So another reversal, possibly?
Yes. So, you're catering to your clientele, if you will, in driving your politics. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right? Now, as you can see, Japan and Taiwan in the past have been a problem. China is a huge threat now. So President Trump, though he's set out to reconfigure this whole tariff thing, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because we've seen it back and forth, up and down, through this whole period of time.
Right.
From the beginning of our country, all right? Having targeted coal and steel now, all right? Basically, he's got the coal and steel workers behind him.
Yes.
So naturally, he's going to put a huge tariff on coal and steel for foreign countries that want to bring their coal and steel in. And, okay, let's talk, all right? Because China can't produce, they can't, they're in a situation where they need to buy stuff from us as well.
Right.
Natural resources.
Yes.
And so bottom line to this is we're seeing that they're picking certain things that we're going to really jack the tariffs up on in order to protect our workers, coal and steel. All right, and aluminum's another one, okay?
Yes.
So whatever course this all takes, whatever course it takes, you can see that the arguments and discussions back and forth over all these years play a huge role in the U.S. economy.
Yes.
I hope all this has helped a little bit with understanding what's going on. Yeah. But, instead of just sitting there watching the news and saying, my God, they jacked the tariff up to 300% today, go back and look and say, and what impact is that going to have? Where is that going to lead us to in the future?
Right.
Cool?
Cool.
That's all I got.
I don't know.
You got anything for us?
I do have a couple of things. I'll kind of go through them kind of quick.
Oh, okay.
One of the things, I didn't kind of dress up today, but I do.
I love it.
I had to sport our new apparel.
Yes.
We do have a link on our website for library shirts. We have T-shirts, sweatshirts, long sleeve T-shirts, and hoodies, my favorite. It's a little warm for hoodie right today. I think it's supposed to be 80 degrees, but the pricing on them is not extreme. T-shirts are $15, long sleeve T-shirts are $19, sweatshirts are $22, and hoodies, again, $27. And that's for adult and youth sizes. If you order anything that's a 2X, 3X, 4X, or 5X, there is a little bit of a surcharge for that, just a little bit of a up to a $5 fee, I think is. So for like 2X, it's a $2 extra fee, 3X, $3, 4X, $5.
There you go. So they make stuff that'll fit me.
Yeah.
Don't have to go.
Now, I do have to say that this is an extra large. They're supposed to be unisex. It is a little tight.
Yes.
I should probably gone with the 2X.
Yeah.
So if you're ordering for a gentleman, you may want to keep that in mind.
Or your husband, either one.
Well, either one.
Gentleman or your husband.
My husband or spouse or
cool. All right.
the
Great.
male reader in your life, whatever.
Yes.
And these are done by Malibu Blue Outfitters. These are done locally. So you can either have them shipped to your house or you can go pick them up from Malibu Blue at no charge. So there is shipping for if you have it shipped to your house.
Okay.
The other thing is our Reading as a Journey Passport program. We've
Yes.
extended that to May,
Okay.
to the end of May, just to give more people more time to go and do that. We didn't get as much promotion out the first part of April as we would like, so we're going to extend that through May.
Great.
The other thing is just kind of real quick is the University of Missouri Extension Office will be here starting April 20th on getting healthy through gardening. So they're going to go through topics like how to learn how to make healthy food choices, how to read nutrition labels, learning how growing a garden can help you save money on your food bill, since how
Yes.
we're talking about
in
these
case
tariffs.
there's a tariff on
In
it,
case
yeah.
there's a tariff, at
Right.
least maybe you can, become a vegetarian.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
Learn about planting, cultivating, harvesting, composting, and more. And that is done through, like I said, the University of Missouri Extension Office. They'll
Now,
come in here.
Here's the
and do
thing,
that.
just getting healthy through gardening, I think my wife sees it differently. She's saying, here's all these healthy things you can eat, but I'm getting healthy by out there with a hoe in my hands doing all this work,
Yep.
you see. So,
Yep.
But
And
she
that's
said,
the
look
other
how
thing-
healthy you are, right?
And that is the other thing apart about that, is that there is discussion in that, because you're outside, you're getting the exercise, you're having to do these physical things to plant this garden, having to harvest it, take care of it, and things like that. So that all kind of plays into it.
I hope they say something about what to do with chipmunks and squirrels. And deer, right?
We have a really big fence
Yes.
out here
Oh, there
in
you
the
go.
community garden.
There you go.
But that's going to be here at the Camdenton Library
Great.
at 1:30 to
Awesome.
2:30. And then,
Wonderful.
yeah, so that's one thing that's coming up. Another thing that's coming up here at the Camdenton Library is on Saturday, May 3rd. If you are a jigsaw puzzle lover,
Yeah.
we're going to do a puzzle swap. So you bring as many puzzles in that you have to swap or want to swap. As long as they're not missing any pieces and are at least 250-piece puzzles, you can bring those in and trade those for a new puzzle to take home.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's from 10 a.m. to 11 on May 3rd. The other thing is we have NERF battles. We've talked about those before. Usually it's the teens. We have one for the teens. We have one for the tweens for the 7 to 11. Parents were feeling a little left out, so
Sure.
we've solved that problem. Now
Yay.
that on the May 16th, it's teens versus parents. So this is, maybe your kid did something earlier in the day, and grounding may not be enough. So you
I
can
think
chase it with a
that's
Nerf gun.
I think that's great. A great release. You know?
Exactly, right?
Yes,
That was one of
really.
the things, even when we first started doing the Nerf wars, I kind of led those, and we would, the kids would be like, all right, Coli, let's go, and so they would purposely shoot at me, and so I'd have to go chase them. It was
Yes.
fun, and again, exercise.
Right.
Definitely need that, but it was great. It's fun. The kids have fun. It's just a fun atmosphere. So we thought, parents, it's your turn
Excellent.
to step up.
There you
and
go.
play
like
with the
it.
kids. So, and then I know we'll do one for the tweens versus parents as well, but that one's in June, I think. So we'll
Okay.
have more on that one.
Great.
And then also with May just being right around the corner, that means kids are getting out of school.
Yes.
What do you do with them?
Oh, you're asking?
I-
What have I done with them?
No,
Oh,
we're not.
Okay.
That's when our summer reading program starts.
Absolutely.
So I know that school is just getting out. I think it's fairly early this year,
Yeah.
early May. But starting May 17th we'll have our kickoff party here
Yeah.
at Camdenton like we did last year.
That's a ton of fun.
It
too.
is. We're going to have entertainment. We're going to have Mr. B here. We're going to have the bluegrass, the Golden Bluegrass group that plays in the afternoons
Yes.
here on Thursdays here. The Highway Experience. She was here last year. We're going to have food trucks, and I think there's going to be some different story times, and kids, everybody can sign up for summer reading program. Go ahead and get a jump on that, so that way when we start actually logging that reading and stuff, you're kind of ahead of the game on that one. So
It's great fun.
it is great
It is.
fun. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it. And
Me
that's from
too.
10 a.m. to 2 p.m. here at the Camdenton parking lot. So
Yeah. Great.
yeah,
Great.
I think I kind of went through that kind of fast, but
You did good.
thanks.
Yeah.
There's more that we've got. We do have the new magazine coming out
Yes.
next
Yes.
week, hopefully.
Yes. Good deal.
So
We also, you mentioned the bluegrass group. They're
Yes.
here on Thursdays.
Yes.
Right here. And,
they actually play right where we're sitting
Yeah.
at, basically.
and I mean, amazing. I mean, I was sitting back in my office one day and heard this stuff, and I thought, what in the world? And I come out here, and I mean, it's a big group, and they're true musicians. They're the kind of people that, one of them will say, do you know this one? And the next thing you know, there's 8 people, 10 people, just
Yes.
right in and going. You know,
Yes.
I wish I had that kind of talent, and they're amazing.
They are amazing
And we get a
people.
lot of people come in, just sit right where you all are right here, and they are,
listen, yeah.
if you got the time, they are well worth your time to stop by and
It's
listen to
amazing.
them, especially on a rainy day like this. Yeah.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that's what it was last week. We had still quite a group last week
Oh,
when
yeah.
it was raining and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So
So I have
Good.
one final question for you.
yes.
What's our topic for May?
You know what? We've talked so much about China, maybe we ought to do China next month. What do you think?
That's fine.
I think it
whatever
might
you
be
wanna do.
interesting to dive in a little bit and say, what are we going to do with these billion people? Yes, ma'am.
Or austerity. What happens in austerity?
Austerity.
Austerity programs that happen to countries, what happens to that country?
That's another interesting topic. Well,
That one-
let's,
that'd be-
yeah. There you go. Now I've got 2 things to work on.
There you got two
right?
things to work
okay.
on.
Good. Great.
So-
All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully, you can you share with your friends. You're the experts on tariffs now. You
Should
know,
be anyway, right?
Huh?
Should be now, right?
Well, yeah, you should be, right? Yeah.
Unless we've confused people.
That's
more.
right. No, but like I say, I think it's important. Do your own research.
That's what we're here
We
for.
happen to have libraries around here.
do
And,
have 6 of them.
all kinds of great information you can tap into, interesting individuals. So by all means, we're here to help you. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.